Thank you very much. It is a particular pleasure to be here at a time when a friend and a colleague is being honored. I think we come to know a people by how we honor each other, and to see, in this case, the occasion for which Bill's being honored, this university community engagement, is a particularly sweet time to be present. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to offer a bit of a reflection on this work, from knowledge to impact. We've seen, and I have admired for years, I'd say Bill is much older than I am, but that's a lie. We're pretty much the same cohort, but I have admired for years this extraordinary story. It is rare to see an innovation like this refined in practice with guidance and feedback, and then sustained. It is such a rare thing to see that happen, and a joy to help celebrate it. So what I want to do is sort of step back and offer a reflection on knowledge to impact. We heard an impact story. We heard a story of knowledge to impact, and what some of the stepping stones might be, and what we all know to be a rocky path. So that's what I'd like to offer as an opportunity. This award, the regional recipient of which is the team is present today, had some interesting language in it. I was really fascinated. I mean, what it's doing is reminding us that the core functions of university, in the top part, of learning, discovery, and engagement. It's saying that these are functions. These are the how of what we do, and there's the why portion of a mission statement like this that I think is equally intriguing. I think we would say that this work, I'm not sure I would have chosen the term sympathetically engaged, but if we mean by that being in sync with need and concern, we would, I think, agree that this is a wonderful exemplar. The productively part, I suspect Bill and team insisted upon. That is, they would offer evidence that it had impacts at all these levels, all these ecological levels. It is a beautiful exemplar, and it's a treat to reflect on it with you. Other people have named this work, and we should recognize the mashup in web terms of this, right? We're mashing up ideas in a piece of work like this. And there are at least two streams, there's a third probably as well, that Ernest Boyer talked about, the former president of the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching. And this notion of scholarship of discovery, with its focus on understanding, is something that the academy is used to revering. What Boyer was trying to do is lift up the scholarship of application and suggest that this also was virtuous, that this was a good thing, that applying knowledge was a good thing, and he was trying to make the case that this mattered. He didn't name a scholarship of engagement, but clearly you have been about it here. And if the essence of the first two are understanding and improvement, the essence of the third is relationship, and what flows through those relationships. And that's what I'd like to encourage a reflection on. And I'll do it through a window that is meaningful to me, work that comes out of public health and health promotion, as a little bit of sort of an analogous angle in thinking about this together, and to suggest the complementarity of that additional discipline in its perspective and its interest to those represented here. But the focal point will be on some stepping stones from knowledge to impact. And I'll name 4 of them, pause on them, and pose some questions that I hope will invite us to recommit to this work individually as well, and hence the aim to consider, so what does it mean to be an engaged scholar? How we doing? What else is left for us to do? How can we build on this fine example? The context that I'll talk about is the work that we've been doing at our center. We were designated maybe 6 years ago now or so as a WHO Collaborating Center. It's essentially all cachet and no cash, like most of these things. It means you have relationships. It means you have relationships with people that are smarter than you. When I played hockey, you wanted to play against people who were smarter than you, better than you at that game. The only way to get better was for that to happen. And it's true, I think, in this game as well. We're looking to find students, colleagues, brighter than us, who can help advance the work. They shaped us into two things. Essentially, they said, if you're going to do this, shape your objectives around expanding the evidence base for the work, and the work I'll talk about in a moment of health promotion. And secondly, it's got to be about building capacity. The workforce is enormous. It extends well beyond universities. And we need to figure out it is everyone. The work of creating the conditions under which health and well-being happen for everyone is everybody's work. And so building capacity and expanding the evidence base ought to be the focal points. It is clearly represented in the work that was described here. I'll offer another angle in. First, a definition. This is WHO's definition of health promotion from a UN document some years ago. But doesn't it look familiar? We could put, it goes beyond prevention, surely, right? And the treatment, prevention, promotion stretch, we're really looking at creating the conditions under which health and well-being occur for everyone. We recognize the justice dimension of this, the equity dimension of this, but we also appreciate it's about environment. It's about assuring the conditions under which better outcomes in health and development happen for all of us. Big, important work. Work that people need to redefine periodically. I was privileged to be at a meeting, this is a picture of the opening session 3 weeks ago in Nairobi, when the 7th every 4-year, whatever that is, quadrennial gathering of people who are renaming, reframing this field. In my experience, that doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often in community psychology and other places where people come together, 600 folks, to essentially rename and frame what the work is about. I had the opportunity to help facilitate one of the tracks on community empowerment with some other folks, and it was a marvelous time where people were literally making this area and the other ones a social construction in the deep meaning of that. That it's in this time and in our context, what does this look like? We can chat about some of the interesting debates that people engaged in, as you can imagine, the ways in which people around the world might define that. So when we ask what this work of health promotion looks like, it's often helpful to have a framework. I like this iterative one. I like the fact, I like this particular frame. And it's one that the Institute of Medicine used in its Future Public Health in the 21st Century, the chapter on community. This looks pretty familiar, does it not? Let's take the example that Bill just treated us to. I'm not sure this is showing up. So at 9 o'clock, improvement in population level outcomes. The recidivism rate data that Bill presented from your collective work represents outcome at the population level. It is a rare thing to be tracking that and to be showing some achievement and movement. We know that moving counterclockwise to affect population level behavior like that, you've got to affect the behavior of a lot of people. And in this initiative, we saw the behavior not only of the usual suspects, youth, but the behavior of those who were responsible for them and who assume responsibility for them, the students, the community members, those who might have contacted them through the judicial system. That involves changing communities and systems. This program is a community change, no question about it. And you had to create the conditions under which this could happen effectively by making adjustments that you commented about at all those levels. We know this work starts at 12 o'clock with assessment, trying to get a sense of the level of the problem, level of the situation, engaging people in planning, taking action, implementing what are now evidence-based, then were practice-informed, data-shaped innovations that evolved over a long period of time to produce this. So it's a game we're all really pretty familiar with, are we not? But it's a long-run game. And to be in this game, to stay in this game effectively, at least in my experience, we have to do things that allow us to stay in the game. And a colleague of ours, Gary Gunderson, you may know from the Carter Center, the Interfaith Health Program at the Carter Center. Gary used to talk about when you engage in a big, audacious, hairy goal, like the one that we just heard about, you have to be a BHAG, as some like to call them. You have to figure out how do you keep from getting wet, right? I mean, what are the stepping stones in that pond to keep us from constantly getting wet, falling in and getting chewed up by the alligators, right? And so I think, we're witness to that. And I want to sort of explicate a few of those stepping stones. They start, not surprisingly, in an engagement context with connecting, right? This is the first stepping stone. It is the thing we do at the beginning. It is the thing that allows us to join. We typically do that on a values base. We're there because we share in a common concern. We are joined, we are in solidarity with people in a place. That's how it begins. And it always starts in relationships. This is a colleague of ours from the African Institute for Health Development in Nairobi. And Mary Naimongo is an absolutely astounding person on the World Health Organization scene and in the informal settlements in Nairobi. She is at home at WHO in Geneva and at home in informal settlements in and around Nairobi. She also is the grounding for what I hope will be some collaborative work together. It is absolutely implausible that a gringo like me and others in our team who are outside the African context could possibly contribute functionally. We have to have teachers. We have to have guides. And similarly, there is the hope that there are things that would be useful in that connection, much like the connections that Bill articulated. We appreciate their fancy terms for this now. We didn't talk about, Malcolm Gladwell's book wasn't out yet. We hadn't talked about connectors and their function, nor was Putnam's work. But when we appreciate the role as connectors, we are strengthening social ties. Our first responsibility is to do no harm in our engagements. And my bet is that each of us has done harm in our engagements. And we have to be open to the experience of what happens when that harm gets done and why the feedback loops are so critical in this. We also have to build bridges across groups. Putnam has taught us that the rarest form of social capital is not the bonding kind, not the connecting, but the bridging kind. The things that connect across groups. And so how resources flow, how money and other resources flow across our systems is part of what we do. It's part of our job, is to enable that to happen, is to construct and literally construct and reconstruct when they're broken, those bridges. Everyone in this room has done that. We now call it social capital. We may not have called it, we call it bananas, but it's the stuff that happens when we build those bridges. So let's pause on this connecting piece. And I take this to be each of our work. It seems to me when we connect, it ultimately starts with discernment. I'm an Irish Catholic kid. I think about discernment as what happens when we construct a vocation. And when we do, it's when something feels right to us, seems right to those who care about us, right? And we've got the opportunity. When those things are joined, we're in line, right? We've got something. And it starts by joining what issues matter to us. What are the things that outrage us? What are the things that get us up, get us wondering, get us moving? And what are the groups who are most affected by those things? That's where we start, and it's the basis. And then we have to ask ourselves, how is it we're going to be able to be fruitfully engaged? With whom do we have to connect to make that happen? I think that's how it starts, which is why the service learning dimension, before it had a name, that's been part of this project for 30-some years, is part of what's so critical here. It's because how people discover what it is that moves them. I want more of that. I want less of that. It's that warmer, colder dimension that is so critical. Seeing is the next piece. When I reflect on seeing and thinking about this as the next step, because we need the connections to give us the guides, the Mary Naimongos of the world, to help us see, right? We are absolutely lost without the guides. We can't see we don't know what we're looking at. We don't know what it is that's happening. And each of us have so many examples of this that without our guides, we are lost. I love this quote from Annie Dillard's book on Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. It reminds us what the essence of seeing is. And she was talking about walking along a creek bed and what you see in the patches of color. But I think it's true for us too, that seeing is, of course, very much a matter of verbalization. It's what we can put words to, right? What we can put measures to in a scientific sense. It's what I call attention to, bring attention to our eyes. Without that, we don't see it. That's what those measures were about. Those measures were not the ones, Bill taught us, those are not the measures that you started with. They were largely without use. They didn't have function in advancing the innovation. Measures are discovered, they're selected for when audiences care about things and you try to figure out how to name them and make them visible. Because what we do when we see, it's a matter of focusing attention, right? And our responsibility is to focus attention, I think, in two ways. Usually we talk about one of them as scientists. Let's talk about the other one as well. We focus attention on what is and what ought to be. That's our job, right? Our twofold job is to focus attention on what is, what ought to be, and to note the gap, right? That's what we're doing, always, right? We're noting the gap. And when we do our assessments, when we do our measurements, always we're focusing attention on what is. We have a responsibility in a much more of our qualitative community organizer way. It's the essence of macro practice and social work. Each discipline's got its own frame for this, where our job becomes to also help people envision what could be, what should be, what's possible in the place. That's what organizers do. They can name it, right, in a way that people find credible. And all of a sudden it seems possible and plausible to be able to make those things happen. Our job, and this is what I like about the joining of these, is if we couple these, then we might start out with some measures. When we're engaged in what things are and then what they ought to be and the gap between them, we're constantly being asked the critical thinking question of what success would look like. And that informs our measures, right? So the vision articulates what ought to be. How it is we'll know it is the answer addressed by the second question, and that leads us back. This then plays out in whatever our framework is. And so we're constantly measuring, assessing, and moving our way through in the usual spots assessment, but we're also measuring process. There were a lot of process measures in what Bill described. Implementation of evidence-based approaches. You were concerned about the fidelity of what was being put in play as it was emerging and what form it took and so on, as well as the other logical spots in which we'd stop. So when we reflect on seeing, it seems to me we've got a couple of things to consider. One of them is, and it starts, I think, with what we want to see. This starts with who we're connected to, in spirit and in solidarity, as our Latin American colleagues would want us to say, right? Who are we connected to, and where do we see as what's good enough for our kids in this context? So what is, what ought to be? And then if we realize what would things look like and how would we know it, brings us back to what it is we measure. So it's that joining of community organization practice with measurement and science that I think is part of what sets up discovery and application. When Boyer talked about this, he talked about these as distinct forms of scholarship, and indeed they are separable. We wouldn't separate them, though. It's wrong-headed to separate them. We'd say that which we discover in the purest sense, Bill made allusion to this earlier, when we discover things under the rarefied conditions, I think the term he used, under rarefied conditions, it has no external validity. We may demonstrate the purest cause and effect relationships, but if they're not in contexts that are like the contexts in which they would ultimately be applied, they have so much less value. NIH is just beginning to get its head around, gee, we need to balance external validity with internal validity. Cause and effect is really important for us to understand. But if we don't understand this contextually, we don't have knowledge that's worth applying, that can be applied in a useful way. So one of the things that I think most interests me of the relatively new naming and framing of wine in new bottles is community-based participatory research. And it's as if our colleagues at NIH have just discovered this. They're around for a while. Kurt Lewin had a clue as to this, and people well before him, right, had a clue as to what this was. But it is a radical idea, and that it's now coming out of NIH is really interesting. I could share a story about that later if you like. But this notion of involving community and scientific partners in shared responsibilities for understanding and improving effects is a radical framing. I'll suggest that in a moment. It is the joining of experiential, as Bill put it earlier, and specialized knowledge. We tend to suggest that these are in one place or another. If our universities are set up better, we'd have more experiential knowledge inside. Communities were set up in our relationships better, there'd be more specialized knowledge us, so it's not like where this resides. But the shift from power over to power with is the radical idea. And here's how I think it plays out. I won't go at the details of this for time, but think about what, starting at 12 o'clock, this team has done over the years. It's called adolescent diversion, the naming and framing of adolescent diversion, not because youth named it that, right? Or parents named it that, but the funding agent, I'm sure, had a role in suggesting in the context, the system you were trying to affect, that was a relevant naming and framing for what that issue was about. Others gathered to do it. It might get named and framed entirely differently. We're familiar with this game, right? But we come around this from developing a logic model for how we're going to get from here to there. We name and frame research questions. We document the intervention, its effects. We try to make sense of the data. We use it to inform and celebrate. Coming at 9 o'clock in reverse, the handoff to community, here's our findings, good luck to you putting it in play, has been the norm. The truth, right? That has been the norm. So the idea of power sharing or power abdication to communities is the normative practice, right? You've got our knowledge, do your best, right? And that day is suggested is over. Our responsibility continues in this innovation diffusion model that we've seen articulated so clearly. The making sense of data together, this is much rarer. Whose job it is to give meaning to what it is we've seen. We're the ones who discern statistical significance, the discernment of social significance, the value added, whether the impact is enough, whether it's good enough. That's a judgment we have to make with our colleagues, right? In community, in context, right? That power sharing is not prevalent. That's a struggle. And then come on back up to research questions. Who gets to name those? Typically those who fund us in our studies get to name those. It's a rare exception that a granting agency, and NIH is just cracking the door on this, to let the naming and framing happen in context with community as after you get the money. Good luck selling that one. We've not been really successful on that. You've got to have a pretty good idea what the questions are going to look like, if people are going to buy in. So the power sharing is hardly complete. What I mean to suggest by this only is, what a radical idea. And it's going to be up to the next generations to run with it, I think, to make it more real. Ultimately, this is a couple of colleagues at that same meeting, this discovery and application is a social construction. It is what we do together. It is what we do in community that will make the meaning and the application more probable. Because these three bullets, I think, are the stuff we do. What are we seeing? What does it mean? What are the implications for adjustments? That's the stuff we do when we do systematic reflection, right? And it is our job to figure out how to do that better with our partners. It's also the case that the first three aren't enough. That if the game is knowledge to impact and not knowledge to fusion, which has been the game. That's the game that pays off, right? It's the production of knowledge and its reporting in scholarly journals is the payoff in the academy, right? If you're connected and you see things and are moved to discover and apply, then you got to keep moving in this game. And it ultimately comes to building capacity. So I want to reflect on that for a minute through this notion. That building capacity is a big job. I mean, it's a big job because it means the ability of people to do things across time for sure. It's got a durability dimension to it, and then across concerns. Because the idea is that the community would be able to construct, after you're done in this engagement, they'd be able to construct the next thing in response to the next goal, right? And there's scant evidence that our engagements have yielded this. that the capacity through our engagements together have yielded the generalized ability to solve the next problem. We're not accumulating that evidence in the way that we would hope we might. So what I'll describe is that with humility is a foray into that was alluded to because it gives a window into the challenges of it, not because it's a solution, because it gives a window into the challenges of it. We began with some colleagues around the country and now in other parts of the world 15 years ago with this crazy Tom Wolfe and Bill Berkowitz, other people you know in community psychology, and now many, many partners in this field and others, building this thing called the Community Toolbox. It was a crazy idea. The notion was that if we had a box of tools, if we could, this is 1994, if these tools for how you give personal testimony about how you're affected by an issue, how you organize, engage people in meetings, yada, 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 if that could just be freely available publicly forever, people could download it, get it just in time, print it, et cetera, and if it could be there in perpetuity. That was the notion. What it led us is to discover, and this is a construction now after the fact, is so who goes to such a thing? Capacity of whom? Who shows up for community building tools? And now, 15 years later, it's typically 1 million user sessions a year, 15 minutes a piece, lots of people over the years. You get a sense of who's showing up. And clearly it's people from governmental, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, CBOs, all kinds of stuff from around. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the question is, what are they showing up for? This turned out to be hardly an easy, we started out with kind of an encyclopedia, and then distilling meta tools of what are the core competencies? What does it take? So we started looking through the lens of community development, public health, what we could make of community organization practice, from Jack Rothman and other colleagues' work, development, et cetera. And this is not an unfamiliar list, I don't think. Interestingly, it gets rarefied periodically in credentialing. There's a group in the Galway Consensus met in health promotion, international group. They named about a dozen of those, in essence. Grant writing is irrelevant in some contexts, but you get many of these things. You got to build partnerships. You really need to assess the situation. You really analyze the problem, et cetera. So these are the kinds of things that people seem to need to know. They have taught us that what they want from resources is these things, and not always the same things. They consider the people who show up for something like this usually don't have access to universities. Very often they're in a barrio in Latin America or in the United States, or they're on a reservation, a tribal community. They are in a health ministry in some part of the world, wherever, and they may not have a library. So they would love to have access to things to learn key skills. They also want guidance as to how to solve problems. They would like to know what you would ask of a situation to do a situation assessment as an expert for the common kinds of situations that go wrong in their place. They'd love to get guidance from people like us. Especially, not so much what to do, but how to do it in my circumstance and when to do it. What's happening to me and what should I do in my circumstance? And they typically want access to things when they need it, just-in-time stuff. Not the workshop, not the class, not the degree, but just-in-time access. That's humbling for people who spend 90% of our time teaching in classrooms. It's humbling to get this kind of guidance about the proportion of our time that isn't necessarily helpful. So we started out building this thing that responded to those. So the table of contents is learn skill, right? It's a encyclopedic look at, here's the Hunt 300s. It's now 7,000 pages, so it's a fairly large entity. The do the work is the 16 core competencies. You click on one of those and you get more. It's the web benefit. Click on one of those, you want to learn about evaluation, say. You can then reach in and get a task analysis for evaluation plan, and then reach in for tools on how you develop a mission statement and identify stakeholders and what their interests are, et cetera, with the assumption that not everybody knows how to do this stuff. We try to name competencies for which there was a consequence. That was our goal. If somebody's asking you to develop an evaluation plan or sustainability plan or an assessment, then probably there are contingencies on learning those things, which means there's a bigger audience than the students that we can force to learn them because they're in the syllabus. That was the logic. It was pretty much that crude. This was the first thing, and it was the troubleshooting guide. And so you click on one of about 13. This was a construction with a lot of people. Bill, I don't know if we asked you about this. I'll bet we did. To construct, to name the common problems that occur in community work. There are about 13, 14 of them. You click on one of them, like not enough action to promote change. And then the left-hand column is the kind of questions that people ask when they do a situation assessment, on the assumption that that's rare. To have in the place, in the time, somebody who can facilitate a discussion of an assessment of the situation is rare. So that's been useful. The Ask an Advisor we were chatting about earlier. Bill Berkowitz, one of the members of this team, based in Massachusetts. Bill is all over. He has made a career of being, he's just a gem of a person. And he's the sweetest man I know. Bill was all about how can we create a space where anyone in the world could ask a question and receive advice from people who had some experience and some knowledge. And so he created this system. I don't know if Michigan State's been part of this rotation yet. I hope you all do this, where teams of community psychologists, mostly some people in public health, basically agree to accept the questions that come in for a 3-month period, and it's in rotation. I don't know how Bill makes it work, and that Bill makes it work. And so it moves around, and you all might want to take a turn doing this at some point. And then the questions and the answers get archived, and it's an emerging knowledge base from the field. What do people want to know? And they get archived. One of the things that's apparent, and I'm going to bring this to a close, is you look at we've looked now since '94 at, so who's using it and what proportion are domestic and international? With the rise of the internet, a little bit of lag, parallels, now with clearly 1/3 of the users are outside the US. And we get a lot of appeals. Could this be in Spanish? And so we embarked on, it's 7,000 pages, so frankly, it takes a while. And light cultural adaptation for Spanish, it's now all as of this summer. Now, all of it's in Spanish, and it checks out. And now it's it's undergirding other curricula, like the health promotion curricula that PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, has designed for the Americas. The undergirding curriculum for this is the toolbox, because it exists, and a lot of other stuff doesn't, at least not for free. Our aspiration, and this is where I want to bring it more broadly, and we hope to start on Arabic soon. But I want to shift. I want to come back. Capacity building in a global community. And this is all of us, right? This isn't the toolbox. This is all of us. What do we do to assure contextually appropriate knowledge that people could access and avail themselves and contribute to? The common well is how I think is a lovely analogy for this, because it's not just what people take, it's what people leave. And so the innovations that emerge for how one does advocacy in Thailand cannot be the same as how we try to do it in our communities. It cannot be the same. The forms of resistance you'd expect would be different, at least in their form, in their typology, if not their kind, right? To take one example. And so one aspiration. In Google Translation, do you all use the Google Translation button? I love it. I love it. It's not bad. It's not bad. I was saying there's a student who had aspirations to have this toolbox in Hindi, and a student who speaks Hindi was in my office 2 days ago, and saying, not bad. You know, the Hindi, just using Google Translation Engine, fairly good. I want to reflect on this and then take us out. The reflection on capacity building and bring us back to our joint responsibility is collectively, I think, we need to sort out, and we don't, whose work is this? To sort out what it is people need to be able to do to create the conditions under which health and development happen for all of us. That is not any one of our disciplines' work. There must be, just the introductions, there must be half a dozen disciplines at least in the room. We know it's not the province of any one of our disciplines. It's sure not the province of those of us in any of our institutions, and nor in any of our countries, right? So how do we create that, and how do we assure access to supports for that as a collective? Because we can do that now. It's too easy to make this information shareable. And so how do we reconnect? It's a dangling G for reasons I don't understand. So if you're looking for the sort of the mythology of that, I can't take you there. But I want to come back to connecting, because I think, and this I want to conclude with this. We can imagine a world where engagement of community and scientific partners in discovery and application, we saw a beautiful example of that today. You have among you, in the work you're all doing in this project and the other projects that you're constructing, lovely examples of this. How do we assure access to, enable access to free, just-in-time resources for these emerging evidence and practice-based innovations that are coming out from your work and from those of others? And maybe the hardest of all, how do we connect across our institutions? I think we're doing better in our university community connections than we are in our university to university ones. The contingencies do not support the latter very well. And Bill was saying at lunch, first time you've been here? Yeah, it really is. And just as it was a couple of years ago, it was the first time you set foot on our campus, I think. And that's crazy. And so how do we do this in light of the communications technologies advantages that we have? So leave that as a shared challenge for us, and then we can have some discussion if you wish. Thank you.